Okay, everyone, so this is what I was thinking today. Surely there is a difference between God, who spoke through the true prophets, and the Oracle of Delphi. The true prophets, Jeremiah, repent, repent, you have sinned against God. Isaiah, so many. But there are others who spoke perhaps through, who were political leaders, perhaps. And in the ancient times, there were many who would say, God said to me, okay? And it's only not on ancient times. There are many leaders today who will not say God spoke to me, but indirectly, this is what has been said and this is what we are doing. I think there is a difference between history and religion, and history sometimes even nearing mythology, as it were. So what I want to say is that there is a difference between true prophets and false prophets, or true prophets and soothsayers, and politicians who will invoke the name of God and so on. So this is what I thought. I thought I would share with you the Trojan War. Why? Well, why not? Okay, what do we know about the Trojan War? Okay, so many of you I know will know all about it, but some of you may not, and a few may know about Helen, who was stolen away, and 1,000 ships, and Achilles and his heel, and of course the famous horse. Yeah, so I thought that I would actually, for those of you who do not know the whole story, to share with you, and I am being guided by Edith Hamilton, Mythology, who I love her, and this book was published in the 1940s, I believe, and she's actually praised because it is said of her that she actually wrote about mythology the way you should write about mythology, the right way. So, who is the cast here? Okay, we have Troy and we have Sparta. Sparta sitting Greece, and Troy, who was in Asia Minor, okay, where is now Turkey. And if you look at it, it's actually between the two, there is the Aegean Sea. Okay, so Troy is right there where the Dardanelles are. Okay, south of Gallipoli. You remember Gallipoli from the First World War, where so many Australians fell there. Well, it's in between is the Dardanelles, but just look, there is an ocean between them. Okay, so these two cities are going to go to war. Why? The cast for Troy, just going to give it, because sometimes we get confused with the names, they're difficult names and so on. Okay, the king of Troy is King Priam. He has many sons and daughters. One of them is the Prince Paris, who's the one who steals Helen. Okay. The other one is he's married to Queen Hecuba, and he has many sons and daughters. But the protagonist here is going to be Hector, the great warrior who's going to go against Achilles. Now, that is on the Troy side. On the Sparta side, you have their King Menelaus. I hope I pronounce it properly. Okay, so he's the king of Sparta. His brother, Agamemnon, is also a king of another city in Greece, and they're going to go together in war against Troy. And here you're going to have many heroes. You're going to have Achilles, you're going to have Odysseus, and many others. And in this war, we're also going to have the gods in Olympus and the goddesses fighting each other, because they have all chosen which side they're fighting for or against. So, as we go along, more than 2,000 years before Christ, near the eastern end of the Mediterranean was a very great city, very rich and powerful, second to none on earth. The name of it was Troy, and even today no city is more famous. The cause of this long-lasting fame was a war told of in one of the world's greatest poems, the Iliad. And the cause of the war went back to a dispute between three jealous goddesses. Before the war starts, we have what we call the Judgement of Paris. Okay, so what was this? All right, there was an evil goddess, the goddess of discord in Olympus, who no one wanted to have to do anything with her, and they never invited her to banquets, and she was mad because of it. So one day at a marriage feast between King Peleus and the sea nymph Thetis, she was the only one left out. All the other divinities were invited, and she went into the banqueting hall, and with a golden apple, she threw a golden apple there, marked for the fairest. Of course, all the goddesses wanted it. They all wanted to be the fairest. But in the end, the choice came down to three goddesses: Aphrodite, in Latin Venus, Hera, Zeus' wife, and Athena, Queen of War. So the three of them wanted it, so they asked the god of gods, Zeus, to choose, to judge between them. Well, Zeus, who was a ladies' man, knew quite a lot about women. He was always falling in love with the daughters of Earth and everything, all kinds of things. So he knew women well enough to say, I'm not going to choose between which one of you is the favorite or the fairest. So he refused to judge that and to have anything to do with the matter, but he told them to go to Mount Ida near Troy, where the young Prince Paris, also called Alexander, was keeping his father's sheep. He was an excellent judge of beauty, Zeus told them. Paris, though a royal prince, was doing shepherd's work. Why? Because his father Priam, the king of Troy, had been warned that this prince would someday be the ruin of his country, and so he had sent him away to do some work. So at the moment he was living with a lovely nymph named Oenone. Okay, so to his amazement, he was working away there as a shepherd, and there appeared before him these wonderful, wondrous forms of three great goddesses. He was not asked, however, to choose and say who was the fairest. He was actually asked to choose between the three offers that each one of them would give him, which is not the same thing. Not who was the most beautiful, but I am going to offer you something, she is going to offer you something, and her something else. You choose which one is best. To consider the bribes, that is what he had to choose. Nevertheless, the choice was not easy. What men cared for most was set before him. Hera promised to make him lord of Europe and Asia. Athena offered him that he would lead the Trojans to victory against the Greeks and lay Greece in ruins. Aphrodite, however, she told him that she would help him choose the fairest woman in all the world, and this woman, would be his. Paris, who was a weakling and a sort of a coward too, as we will see, chose the last one. And he gave, therefore, Aphrodite the golden apple. So that was the Judgement of Paris, famed everywhere as the real reason why the Trojan War was fought. The fairest woman in all the world was Helen, the daughter of Zeus. He had many daughters. Okay. Such was the report of her beauty that not a young prince in Greece but wanted to marry her. When her suitors assembled in her home to make a formal proposal for her hand, there were so many and from such powerful families that her reputed father, King Tyndareus, he was her mother's husband. Her real husband, her real father was Zeus. But anyway, the Tyndareus, her mother's husband, was afraid to select one among them, among all the suitors, fearing that the others would unite against him. So he therefore exacted first a solemn oath from all that they would champion the cause of Helen's husband, whoever he might be, if any wrong was done to him through his marriage. They will never go to war, they would help whoever the husband would be. It was, after all, to each man's advantage to take the oath, since each was hoping that he would be the person chosen. So they all bound themselves to punish to the uttermost anyone who carried or tried to carry Helen away. And then Tyndareus chose Menelaus, the brother of Agamemnon, and made him king of Sparta as well. Okay, so Menelaus is the one who is chosen to be Helen's husband, and he was made king of Sparta. So that is how matters stood when Paris gave the golden apple to Aphrodite. The goddess of love and beauty knew very well where the most beautiful woman on earth was to be found, and she led the young shepherd, with never a thought about his present girlfriend, Oenone. She led him without a thought straight to Sparta, where Menelaus and Helen now received him together very graciously as their guest. The ties between guest and host were strong. Each was bound to help and never harm the other. But Paris broke that secret bond. Menelaus, trusting him, had to go off to Crete and left them together. And the poem says, Paris, who coming entered a friend's kind dwelling, shamed the hand there that gave him food, stealing away a woman. When Menelaus got back to find Helen gone, he called upon all Greece to help him. The chieftains responded as they were bound to do. Two, however, of the first rank, 2 warriors, 2 chieftains were missing. One was Odysseus, who was the king of the island of Ithaca, and the other one was Achilles, the son of Peleus and the sea nymph Thetis. Odysseus, who was one of the shrewdest and most sensible men in Greece, did not want to leave his house and family to embark on a romantic adventure overseas for the sake of a faithless woman. He pretended, therefore, that he had gone mad, so he couldn't go to war. And when a messenger from the Greek army arrived, the king pretended to be mad, so he was ploughing a field and sowing it with salt rather than seed. But the messenger was very shrewd too, and he seized Odysseus' little son and put him directly in the way of the plough. Instantly the father turned the plough aside, thus proving that he had all his wits about him. However reluctant, he had to join the army. Achilles, he was actually kept back by his mother. The sea nymph knew that if he went to Troy, he was fated to die there. So she sent him to the court of another king, and made him wear women's clothes and hide among the maidens. So there he was, and Odysseus was dispatched by the other chieftains to find him out, to see where he was. So he disguised himself as a peddler and went to the court where the lad was said to be, with many gay ornaments in his backpack, such, the poem says, such as women love, jewelry and necklaces and earrings and things. But also, amidst all that, he put some fine weapons. So when he displays them all, while the girls flocked around the trinkets, Achilles fingered the swords and the daggers. And so Odysseus knew him then, and he had no trouble at all in making him disregard what his mother had said and go to the Greek camp with him. And he did. So now the great fleet made ready. 1,000 ships carried the Greek host. They met at a place called Aulis, a place of strong winds and dangerous tides, impossible to sail from as long as the north wind blew, and it kept on blowing and blowing day after day. It broke men's heart, says the poem. It broke men's heart, spared not ship, nor cable. The time dragged, doubling itself in passing. The army was desperate, and at last the Soothsayer Calchas declared that the gods had spoken to him. What they said to him was this: Artemis was angry, one of the goddesses. One of her beloved wild creatures, a hare, had been slain by the Greeks, together with her young, and the only way to calm the wind and ensure a safe voyage to Troy, where they wanted to go and fight and get Helen, the only way was to appease her by sacrificing to her a royal maiden. The royal maiden was Iphigenia, who actually happened to be the eldest daughter of the commander-in-chief, King Agamemnon. This was terrible to all, but to her father hardly bearable. If I must slay the joy of my house, my daughter, a father's hands stained with dark streams flowing from blood of a girl
slaughtered before the altar. Nevertheless, he yielded. His reputation with the army was at stake, and his ambition to conquer Troy and exalt Greece. He dared the deed, slaying his child to help the war. He sent home for her, writing to his wife that he had arranged a great marriage for her, a marriage to Achilles, the great warrior, who had already shown himself the best and greatest of all chieftains. But when she came to her wedding, she was carried to the altar to be killed. The poem says, and all her prayers, cries of "Father, Father," her maiden life, these they held as nothing, the savage warriors battle mad. She died, and the north wind ceased to blow, and the Greek ships sailed out over a quiet sea. But the evil price they had paid was bound some day to bring evil down upon them. The 1,000 ships carried a great host of fighting men, and the Greek army was very strong. But the Trojan city was strong too. Priam, the king, and his queen Hecuba had many brave sons to lead the attack and to defend the walls, one above all, Hector, than whom no man anywhere was nobler or more brave, and only perhaps Achilles was the other greater warrior. So you had Hector on Troy's side and Achilles on the Greek side. The champion of the Greeks, Achilles. Each knew that he would die before Troy was taken. Achilles had been told by his mother, "Very brief is your lot. Would that you would come free now from tears and troubles, for you shall not long endure, my child, short-lived beyond all men, and to be pitied." Now, no divinity had told Hector anything, but he was equally sure that he would die. "I know well in my heart and in my soul," he said to his wife Andromache, "the day shall come when holy Troy will be laid low, and my father Priam and Priam's people too." Both heroes fought under the shadow of certain death. For 9 years victory wavered, now to this side, now to the other. Neither was able to gain any decided advantage. And then a quarrel flared up between 2 Greeks. The Greeks started fighting among themselves. Achilles and Agamemnon, the king. And for a time, because of that, it turned the tide in favor of the Trojans. What was the reason for this? Another woman. Her name was Chrysis, daughter of Apollo's priest, whom the Greeks had carried off and given to Agamemnon. Her father, the priest, came to beg for her release, but Agamemnon would not let her go. Then the priest prayed to the mighty god he served, Apollo, and Apollo heard him. From his sun chariot he shot fiery arrows down upon the Greek army, and men sickened and died, so that the funeral pyres were burning continuously. There was a pestilence too. At last Achilles called an assembly of the chieftains. The Trojans were winning because the Greeks were fighting amongst themselves, now because of this other girl, Chrysis. So Achilles called everyone, and he told them that they could not hold out against both the pestilence and the Trojans at the same time, and that they must either find a way to appease Apollo or else just give up and sail home. But then the prophet Calchas stood up and said he knew why the god was angry, but that he was afraid to speak up unless Achilles could guarantee his safety. Achilles said, "I do so, speak, even if you accuse Agamemnon himself." Just in case he said, look, the fault is Agamemnon's. If he were to give up the girl and give her back to her father, then perhaps everything will be over. We'll be at peace, at least amongst ourselves. So every man there understood what that meant. They knew how Apollo's priests had been treated. When Calchas declared that Chryseis might be given back to her father, he had all the chiefs behind him, and Agamemnon, greatly angered, was obliged to agree. "But," he said, "if I lose her, who was my prize of honor," he told Achilles, "I will have another in her stead." So, therefore, when Chryseis had been returned to her father, Agamemnon sent 2 of his squires to Achilles' tent to take his prize of honor away from Achilles. And this was another woman, the maiden Briseis. Briseis was with Achilles. Well, now Agamemnon, who had to give up Chryseis, now he wanted Achilles' girl, Briseis. So the ambassadors went. Most unwillingly they went and stood before the hero Achilles in heavy silence. But he, Achilles, knowing their errand, told them it was not they who had wronged him, or who were about to wrong him. They were just following orders. Let them take the girl without fear for themselves. But hear him first, while he swore before gods and men that Agamemnon would pay dearly for the deed. That night, Achilles' mother, silver-footed Thetis, the sea nymph, came to him, and she was as angry as he was, and she told him to have nothing more to do with the Greeks, and with that she went up to heaven and asked Zeus to give success to the Trojans. Zeus was very reluctant. The war by now had reached Olympus itself, and the gods were ranged against each other. Aphrodite, of course, was on the side of Paris, of Troy. Equally, of course, Hera and Athena were against him, so they were for Greece. Ares, the god of war, always took sides with Aphrodite, Troy, while Poseidon, lord of the sea, favored the Greeks, a sea people, always great sailors. Apollo cared for Hector, Troy, and for his sake helped the Trojans, and Artemis, as his sister, did so too. Zeus liked the Trojans best, generally speaking, on the whole, but he wanted to be neutral here because Hera was so disagreeable whenever he opposed her openly, and she was very much for the Greeks. However, he could not resist Thetis for the Trojans. So he had a hard time with Hera, who guessed, as she usually did, what he was about to do. He was driven finally into telling her that he would lay hands upon her if she did not stop talking. Hera kept silence then, but her thoughts were busy as to how she might help the Greeks and circumvent Zeus. The plan Zeus made, the plan that he made was simple. He knew that the Greeks without Achilles were inferior to the Trojans. And so therefore he sent a lying dream to Agamemnon, promising him victory if he attacked. In other words, attack, knowing that he would lose. They were inferior. While Achilles stayed in his tent, a fierce battle followed, the hardest yet fought. Achilles did not want to fight. He was so upset with what had happened that he was not going to join the fight, and he stayed in his tent there, mad at everybody. Up on the wall of Troy, the old king Priam and the other old men, wise in the ways of war, sat watching the contest. To them came Helen, the cause of all that agony and death. Yet as they looked at her, they could not feel any blame. Men must fight for such as she, they said to each other, for her face was like to that of an immortal spirit. She stayed by them, telling them the names of this and that Greek hero, until to their astonishment the battle ceased. The armies drew back on either side, and in the space between they drew back, and suddenly you have both Paris and Menelaus facing each other. Paris, who had stolen Helen, and Menelaus, Helen's wife, and here they were looking at each other by themselves, facing each other. It was evident that the sensible decision had been reached to let the two most concerned fight it out alone. Paris struck first, but Menelaus caught the swift spear on his shield and then hurled his own. It rent Paris's tunic, but did not wound him. Menelaus drew his sword, his only weapon now, but as he did so it fell from his hand, broken. Undaunted, though unarmed, he leaped upon Paris and seized him by his helmet's crest, swung him around off his feet. He would have dragged him to the Greeks victoriously if it had not been for Aphrodite. She tore away the strap that kept the helmet on, so that it came away in Menelaus' hand. Paris himself, who had not fought at all except to throw his spear, she caught up in a cloud and took him back to Troy. Furiously, Menelaus went through all the Trojan ranks, looking for Paris. Where is he? Seeking Paris, and not a man there but would have helped him, for they all hated Paris. But he was gone. No one knew how or where. So Agamemnon, since Paris had disappeared, Agamemnon spoke to both armies, and he declared that really Menelaus was the victor, and so he asked the Trojans to give Helen back. This was fair and just, and the Trojans would have agreed. But Athena, at Hera's prompting, interfered. Hera was determined that the war should not end until Troy was ruined. Athena, sweeping down to the battlefield, persuaded the foolish heart of Pandarus, a Trojan. This was a false flag, as we call it today. For him, a Trojan, to break the truce and shoot an arrow at Menelaus. He did so and wounded him, only slightly, but the Greeks, enraged at the treachery, turned upon the Trojans, and the battle was on again. Okay, there is much more, but I'll just... So now this is going back and forth. Okay, sometimes one side is winning, sometimes the other is winning. Hector, for Troy, the son, the hero, of the son of King Priam. As Hector went back to the battle, he turned aside to see once more, perhaps for the last time, the wife that he tenderly loved, Andromache, and his son, Astyanax. He met her on the wall where she had gone in terror to watch the fighting when she heard that the Trojans were in retreat. With her was the handmaid carrying the little boy. Hector smiled and looked at them silently, but Andromache took his hand in hers and wept. "My dear lords," he said, "you who are father and mother and brother unto me as well as husband, please stay here with us. Do not make a widow of me and of your child an orphan." But he refused her gently. He could not be a coward, he said. His country needed him, Troy. It was for him to fight always in the forefront of battle. Yet she could know that he never forgot what her anguish would be when he died. That was the thought that troubled him above all else, more than his many other cares. He turned to leave her, but first he held out his arms to his son. Terrified, the little boy shrank back, afraid of the helmet and its fierce nodding crest. Hector laughed and took the shining helmet from his head. Then, holding the child in his arms, he caressed him and prayed, "O Zeus, and after many years men say of this my son, when he returns from battle, far greater is he than his father ever was." So he laid the boy in his wife's arms, and she took him, smiling, yet with tears. And Hector pitied her and touched her tenderly with his hand, and spoke to her, "Dear one, be not so sorrowful. That which is fated must come to pass, but against my fate no man can kill me." And then, taking up his helmet, he left her, and she went to her house, often looking back at him and weeping bitterly. Then the war went badly for the Greeks. Their great champion was far away, Achilles. Achilles sat alone in his tent, brooding over his wrongs. The great Trojan champion had never before shown himself so brilliant and so brave. Hector seemed irresistible at this time, while Achilles was sitting in his tent. Hector was called the tamer of horses. The Trojans always called him that, and he drove his car through the Greek ranks as if the same spirit animated steeds and driver. He almost won. There was rejoicing in Troy that night, but grief and despair in the Greek camp. Agamemnon himself was all for giving up and sailing back to Greece. "We are losing, let's just go back home." Nestor, another hero, however, who was the oldest among the chieftains and therefore the wisest, wiser even than the shrewd Odysseus, spoke out boldly and told Agamemnon that if he had not angered Achilles, they would have not been defeated. And he said, "Try to find some way of appeasing him," he said, instead of all of us going home to Greece disgraced." All applauded the advice, and Agamemnon confessed that he had acted like a fool. He would send Briseis, the girl, he would send her back to Achilles, he said. He promised that. And with her, many other splendid gifts, and he begged Odysseus to take his offer to Achilles. Now, Odysseus and the two chieftains chosen to accompany him found the hero Achilles with his friend Patroclus, who of all men on earth was dearest to Achilles. Achilles welcomed them courteously and set food and drink before them. But when they told him why they had come, and all of the rich gifts that would be his if he would yield and come to fight, he and beg him to have pity on his countrymen, they received an absolute refusal again. No way, I'm not going. Not for all the treasures of Egypt would he go. He was sailing home, and they would have, if they were wise, they would do the same, he told them. He did not budge. But all rejected that counsel to go back home when Odysseus brought back the answer. The next day they went into battle with the desperate courage of brave men cornered. Again they were driven back until they stood fighting on the beach where their ships were drawn up. They were ready to go home and give up, but help was at hand. Hera had laid her plans. She saw Zeus sitting on Mount Ida watching the Trojans conquer, and she thought how she detested him, her husband, Zeus. But she knew also very well that she could get the better of him only in one way. She must go to him looking so lovely that he could not resist her. And so when he took her in his arms, when he did that, that was her plan, she would pour sweet sleep upon him, and he would forget all about the Trojans. So that is what she did. She went to her chamber and used every art she knew to make herself beautiful beyond compare. Last of all, she borrowed Aphrodite's girdle, wherein were all her enchantments. And with this added charm, she appeared before Zeus. As he saw her, love overcame his heart, so that he thought no more about Troy and the promise he had made to Thetis. At once the battle turned in favor of the Greeks. Ajax, another hero, hurled he hurled Hector to the ground, although before he could wound him, Aeneas, his brother, lifted him and took him away. So now, with Hector gone, the Greeks were able to drive the Trojans far back from the ships, and Troy might have been sacked that very day if Zeus had not awakened in time. He leaped up and saw the Trojans in flight and Hector lying gasping on the plain. All was clear to him, and he turned fiercely to Hera. This was her doing, he said, her crafty, crooked ways. He was half-minded to give her then and there a beating. When it came to that kind of fighting, Hera knew she was helpless. She promptly denied that she had anything to do with the Trojans' defeat. It was all Poseidon, she said. That was the sea god. And indeed the sea god had been helping the Greeks, contrary to Zeus' orders, but only because she had begged him to do so. However, Zeus was glad enough of an excuse not to lay hands on her. He sent her back to Olympus and summoned Iris, the rainbow messenger, to carry his command to Poseidon to withdraw from the field. He had to do so. Now Apollo had revived the fainting Hector and breathed into him surpassing power. Before the two, the god and the hero, the Greeks were like a flock of frightened sheep driven by mountain lions. They fled in confusion to the ships, and the wall they had built to defend them went down like a sand wall children heap up on the shore and then scatter in their play. The Trojans were almost near enough to set the ships on fire. The Greeks, hopeless, thought only of dying bravely. Now, while all this was going on, Patroclus, Achilles' beloved friend, saw the problems that the Greeks were facing. Not even for Achilles' sake could he stay longer away from the battle himself. He had been keeping him company, but he could no longer do so. He had to go and fight, and he said to Achilles, "You can keep your wrath while your countrymen go down in ruin, can you?" He cried to Achilles, "I cannot. Give me your armor. If they think I am you, wearing your armor, the Trojans may pause, and the worn-out Greeks have a breathing space. You and I are fresh. We might yet drive back the enemy. But if you will still sit here nursing your anger, at least let me have the armor." As he spoke, one of the green ships burst into flame. "That way they can cut off the army's retreat," Achilles says. "Go, take my armor, take my men too, and defend the ships. I cannot go. I am a man dishonored. For my own ships, if the battle comes near them, I will fight. I will not fight for men who have disgraced me." So Patroclus put on the splendid armor all the Trojans knew and feared, and led Achilles' men to the battle. And indeed, for a time, Patroclus fought as gloriously as that great hero himself could have done. But at last he met Hector face to face, and his doom was sealed as surely as a boar is doomed when he faces a lion. Hector's spear gave him a mortal wound, and his soul fled from his body down to the house of Hades. Then Hector stripped his armor from him, that was Achilles' armor, and casting his own aside, he put it on. It seemed as though he had taken on to Achilles' strength, and no man of the Greeks could stand before him. Evening came that puts an end to battle. Achilles sat by his tent waiting for his friend Patroclus to return. But instead he saw Nestor's son, a little boy, running towards him. He was weeping hot tears as he ran. "Bitter tidings," he cried out. "Patroclus is falling, and Hector has his armor, your armor." Grief took hold of Achilles, so black that those around him feared for his life. Anyway, so down in the sea caves his mother knew his sorrow and came up to try to comfort him. "I will no longer live among men," he told her. If I do not make Hector pay with his death for my friend's life. Then Thetis, his mother, weeping, bade him remember that he himself was fated to die straight away after Hector. "So may I do," Achilles answered, "I who did not help my comrade in his sore need. I will kill the destroyer of him I loved. Then I will accept death when it comes." Okay, so the battle continued. He left the tent in which he had sat for so long and went down to where the Greeks were gathered. A wretched company. Diomedes was there, grievously wounded. Odysseus was there, Agamemnon, and many another. He, Achilles, felt shame before them, and he told them he saw his own exceeding folly in allowing the loss of a mere girl to make him forget everything else. But that was over. He was ready to lead them as before. Let them prepare at once for the battle. Now the chieftains applauded joyfully, but Odysseus spoke for all when he said that they must first take their fill of food and wine, for fasting men made poor fighters. "Our comrades lie dead on the field, and you call for food?" Achilles answered scornfully. "Down my throat shall go neither bite nor sup until my dear comrade is avenged." And to himself he said, "O dearest of friends, for want of you I cannot eat, I cannot drink." When the others had satisfied their hunger, he led the attack. This was the last fight between the two great champions, as all the immortals knew. They also knew how it would turn out. Father Zeus hung his golden balances and set in one the lot of Hector's death and in the other that of Achilles's. Hector's lot sank down. It was appointed that he should die. Nevertheless, the victory was long in doubt. The Trojans and the Hector fought as brave men fight before the walls of their home. In vain, for nothing could check him as he rushed on, slaughtering all in his path and seeking everywhere for Hector. That was Achilles. By this time the gates of Troy had been flung wide, for the Trojans at last were in full flight now and were crowding into the town. Only Hector stood immovable before the wall. From the gates old Priam, his father, and his mother Hecuba cried to him to come inside and save himself. But he did not heed. He was thinking, "I led the Trojans. Their defeat now is my fault. Then am I to spare myself? And yet, what if I were to lay down shield and spear and go and tell Achilles that we will try to give Helen back and half of Troy's treasures with her? Surely that perhaps will end the war and the fight." But then he said, "No, that will be useless. He would kill me unarmed, as if I were a woman. Better to join battle with him now, even if I die." On came Achilles, glorious as the sun when he rises. Beside him was Athena, but Hector was gone. He wasn't gone. Hector was alone. Achilles had Athena the goddess by his side, But Hector was alone. Why? Because Apollo had left him to his fate. As the pair drew near, he turned and fled. Apollo. 3 times around the wall of Troy, pursued and pursuer ran with flying feet. It was Athena who made Hector stop. She tricked him. She appeared beside him in the shape of his brother, Deiphobus, and with this ally, as he thought, Hector faced Achilles. He thought that he had his brother by his side. And he cried out to him, to Achilles, if I kill you, I will give back your body to your friends. You must do the same to me. Give my body back to my family. But Achilles answered, madman, there are no covenants between sheep and wolves, nor between you and me. And so saying, he hurled his spear. It missed its aim, but Athena brought it back. Then Hector struck with a true aim. The spear hit the center of Achilles' shield, but to what good? The armor was magical. It had been given to her by the goddess and could not be pierced. So that was a little bit of cheating, really. I mean, be fair. So the armor was magical and could not be pierced. He turned then quickly to his brother to get his spear, but of course the brother wasn't there. And then Hector knew the truth. Athena had tricked him, and there was no way of escape. The gods have summoned me to death, he thought. At least I will not die without a struggle, but in some great deed of arms with men yet to be born will tell each other. He drew his sword, his only weapon now, and rushed upon his enemy. But Achilles had the spear, the one Athena had recovered for him. Before Hector could approach, he who knew well that armor taken by Hector from the dead Patroclus aimed at, he knew that the armor had an opening near the throat. It was his armor after all, and drove the spear point in. Hector fell, dying at last. With his last breath he prayed, give back my body to my father and my mother. No prayers from you to me, you dog, Achilles answered. I would that I could make myself devour raw your flesh for the evil you have brought upon me. Then Hector's soul flew forth from his body and was gone to Hades, bewailing his fate, leaving vigor and youth behind. You won't believe what he did next, Achilles. He stripped the bloody armor from the corpse, while the Greeks ran up to wonder how tall he was as he lay there, and how noble to look upon. But Achilles' mind was on other matters. He pierced the feet of the dead man, and fastened them with thongs to the back of his chariot, letting the head trail. And then he lashed his horses, and round the walls of Troy he dragged all that was left of glorious Hector. At last, when his fierce soul was satisfied with vengeance, he stood beside the body of his friend Patroclus and said, hear me even in the house of Hades. I have dragged Hector behind my chariot, and I will give him to the dogs to devour beside your funeral pyre. Well, up in Olympus there was dissension too. This abuse of the dead displeased all the immortals, except Hera and Athena and Poseidon. Especially it displeased Zeus. So he sent Iris to King Priam to order him to go without fear to Achilles, to redeem Hector's body, bearing a rich ransom. And she was to tell him that, to tell King Priam that, violent as Achilles was, he was not really evil, but one who would treat properly a suppliant. And so the aged king heaped a car with splendid treasures, the best in Troy, and went over the plain to the Greek camp. Hermes met him, looking like a Greek youth and offering himself as a guide to Achilles' tent. So accompanied the old man, passed the guards, and came into the presence of the man who had killed and maltreated his son. He clasped his knees and kissed his hands, and as he did so, Achilles felt awe, and so did all the others there, looking strangely upon one another. King Priam said, "Remember, Achilles, remember your own father, of like years with me, and like me wretched for want of a son. Yet I am by far more to be pitied, who have braved what no man on earth ever did before, to stretch out my hand to the slayer of my son." Grief stirred within Achilles' heart as he listened. Gently he raised the old man. "Sit by me here," he said, "and let our sorrow lie quiet in our hearts. Evil is all men's lot, but yet we must keep courage." Then he bade his servants wash and anoint Hector's body, and cover it with a soft robe, so that Priam would not see it, frightfully mangled as it was, and be unable to keep back his wrath. He feared for his own self-control if Priam vexed him. "How many days," Achilles asked, "how many days do you desire to make his funeral? For so long I will keep the Greeks back from battle." So he would allow him to have the days for the funeral without fighting. Then Priam brought Hector home, mourned in Troy as never another. Even Helen wept. She said, "The other Trojans upbraided me, but always I had comfort from you through the gentleness of your spirit, Hector, and your gentle words. You were my only friend." 9 days they lamented him. Then they laid him on a lofty pyre and set fire to it. When all was burned, they quenched the flame with wine and gathered the bones into a golden urn, shrouding them in soft purple. They set the urn in a hollow grave and piled great stones over it. And this was the funeral of Hector, tamer of the horses. And here is where one of the poems, the Iliad, ends. But of course now we have to see what happened with the actual fall of Troy. Excuse me. With Hector dead, Achilles knew, as his mother had told him, that his own death was near. He had driven the Trojans before him up to the wall of Troy. So the Trojans were retreating. There Paris shot an arrow at him, at Achilles, and Apollo guided it so that it struck Achilles' heel in the one spot where he could be wounded, the only one. Why his heel? Well, you see, his mother Thetis, when he was born, had intended to make him invulnerable, and what she did was to dip him into the water of the river Styx. But she dipped the child, but she didn't dip all the way down. She didn't dip the heel. She was holding it by the feet. And she dipped him into the river, but not all the way down, where she had her hand. And that was his heel. So she was careless and did not see to it that the water covered the part of the foot by which she was holding him. Anyway, he was hit there and he died, Achilles. And Ajax carried his body out of the battle while Odysseus held the Trojans back. Now, his arms, his weapons, those marvelous arms that Thetis had brought him from Hephaestus, the magical ones, the magical armor, caused the death of Ajax eventually. What happened? You see, it had been decided in the full assembly that the heroes who best deserved the Achilles' armor were Ajax and Odysseus. One of them would inherit his armor. A secret vote was then taken between the two, and Odysseus got the arms. Such a decision was a very serious matter in those days. It was not only that the man who won was honored, the man who was defeated was held to be dishonored. And so Ajax saw himself disgraced, and in a fit of furious anger, he determined to kill Agamemnon and Menelaus, both. He believed, and with reason, that they had turned the vote against him. At nightfall he went to find them, and he had reached their quarters when Athena struck him with madness. He went mad for a while. And he started fighting all the flock. He thought the flocks and herds of the Greeks were the army, and rushed to kill them all, believing that he was slaying now this chieftain, now that one. Finally he dragged to his tent a huge ram, which to his distracted mind he thought he was Odysseus, and bound him to the tent pole and beat him savagely. Then his frenzy left him. He regained his reason and saw that his disgrace in not winning the arms had been but a shadow as compared with the shame now of his own deeds had drawn down upon him. His rage, his folly, his madness would be apparent to everyone. The slaughtered animals were lying all over the field. He said, "The poor cattle," he said to himself, "killed to no purpose by my hand. And I stand here alone, hateful to men and to gods. In such a state, only a coward clings to life. A man, if he cannot live nobly, can die at least nobly." And he drew his sword and killed himself. The Greeks would not burn his body, though. they buried him instead. They held that a suicide should not be honored with a funeral pyre and urn burial. His death, following so soon upon Achilles', dismayed the Greeks. Victory seemed as far off as ever now. Their prophet Calchas told them that he had no message from the god for them, but that there was a man among the Trojans who knew the future, the prophet Helenus. If they were to capture him, they could learn from him what they should do. So Odysseus succeeded in making him a prisoner, this Trojan prophet, Helenus. And he told the Greeks that Troy would not fall until someone fought against them, against the Trojans, with the bow and arrows of Hercules. But you see, these bow and arrows of Hercules had been given, when Hercules died, to the prince Philoctetes, the man who had fired his funeral pyre and who later had joined the Greek host when they sailed to Troy. But on that voyage, the Greeks stopped at an island to offer a sacrifice, and unfortunately, this Prince Philoctetes was bitten by a serpent, a most frightful wound, and it would not heal. So the Greeks had a choice to make. It was impossible to carry him to Troy as he was ill, but the army could not wait, so they left him finally at the island of Lemnos, then an uninhabited island, although once the heroes of the quest of the Golden Fleece had found plenty of women there, but they thought it was uninhabited anyway. It was cruel to desert the helpless sufferer like that, but they were desperate to get on to Troy, and they thought with his bow and arrows he would at least never lack for food. So they had left him there. So now, when the prophet Helenus spoke, the Greeks knew very well that it would be very hard to persuade him, whom they had so wronged, to give his precious weapons to them. So they sent Odysseus, the master of crafty cunning, to get them by trickery. And at first they tried, but then they went back on it and they actually told him the whole story. And so they persuaded him now to go with them. And he did, with his bow and arrows. And back at Troy, the wise physician of the Greeks healed him. And when at last he went joyfully once again into battle, the first man he wounded with his arrows was Paris. And as he fell, Paris begged to be carried back to his old girlfriend, Oenone, the nymph he had lived with on Mount Ida before the three goddesses had come to him, because she had told him that she knew a magic drug to cure any ailment. So they took him to her, and he asked her for his life. But she refused. His desertion of her, his long forgetfulness, could not be forgiven now in a moment, just because he was in need now himself. And she stood there and watched him die. And then she went away and killed herself. Now, Troy did not fall because Paris was dead. He was indeed no great loss anyway. At last, the Greeks learned that there was a most sacred image of Athena in the city of Troy, called the Palladium, and that as long as the Trojans had it, Troy could not be taken. So they decided to go and steal that image. Accordingly, the two greatest of the chieftains left alive by then, Odysseus and Diomedes, determined to try to steal it. Diomedes was the one who bore the image off. In a dark night, he climbed the wall with Odysseus' help, found the Palladium, and took it to the Greek camp. And with this great encouragement, the Greeks determined to wait no longer, but devise some way to put an end to the endless war. They saw clearly by now that unless they could get the army into the city and take the Trojans by surprise, that they would never conquer it. Almost 10 years had passed since they had first laid siege to the town, and it seemed as strong as ever. The walls stood there uninjured. They had never suffered a real attack. The fighting had taken place for the most part at a distance from them. The Greeks must find a secret way of entering the city or accept defeat. The result of this was a new determination. A new vision was what they came up with, Odysseus, was this stratagem of the wooden horse. It was, as anyone would guess, the creation of Odysseus' mind. So what did he do? He had a skillful worker in wood make a huge wooden horse, which was hollow and so big that he could hold a number of men inside. And then he persuaded, and had a great deal of difficulty in doing so, he persuaded a number of the chieftains to hide inside it, along with himself, of course. They were all terror-stricken except Achilles' son, and indeed what they faced was no slight danger. The idea was that all the other Greeks would pretend that they had left and they had sailed back to Greece. The idea was that all the other Greeks should strike camp and apparently put out to sea. But they would really hide beyond the nearest island, where they could not be seen by the Trojans. So the Trojans could not see them. They couldn't even see the ships. They thought that they had left. Whatever happened, they would be safe. They could sail home if anything went wrong, but of course in that case the men inside the wooden horse would surely die. Odysseus, as can be readily believed, had not overlooked any little detail, and he had not overlooked that fact. His plan was to leave one Greek, by himself alone, behind in the desert camp, ready with a tale calculated to make the Trojans draw the horse into the city, and without investigating it. So there was a man ready there to tell a tall story. Then, when the night was darkest, the Greeks inside were to leave. If they managed to get the horse inside, then they would leave their wooden prison and open the city gates to the army, who were waiting, hidden, which by that time would have sailed back and be waiting before the wall. A night came when the plan was carried out. Then the last day of Troy dawned. On the wall, the Trojan watchers saw with astonishment two sights, each as startling as the other. In front of the gates stood an enormous figure of a horse, such a thing as no one had ever seen, an apparition so strange that it was vaguely terrifying, even though there was no sound or movement coming from it. No sound or movement anywhere. Not even from the camps. They were gone. The noisy Greek camp was hushed. Nothing was stirring there either. And the ships, they were gone. Only one conclusion seemed possible. The Greeks had given up. They had sailed for Greece. They had accepted defeat. All Troy exulted. Her long warfare was over. Her sufferings lay behind her. The people flocked to the abandoned Greek camp to see the sights. Here was where Achilles had sulked for so long. Here was where Agamemnon's tent had stood. This was the quarters of the trickster Odysseus. What rapture to see the places empty, nothing in them now to fear. At last they drifted back to where that monstrosity, the wooden horse, stood, and they gathered around it, puzzled what to do with it. And then the Greek, the only one Greek who had been left behind on purpose, discovered himself to them, made himself visible. His name was Sinon, and he was a most plausible speaker. He was seized and dragged to King Priam, weeping and protesting that he no longer wished to be Greek. No, he hated the Greeks. The story he told was one who had been thought out by Odysseus himself, a masterpiece. What he told them was that Athena had been exceedingly angry, Sinon said, at the theft of the Palladium by the Greeks. And the Greeks in terror had sent to the oracle to ask how they could appease her. The oracle answered, "With blood and with a maiden slain, you calmed the winds when first you came to Troy. Well, with blood must your return be sought. With a Greek life make expiation." That is the story he told them. He himself, Sinon told King Priam, was the wretched victim chosen to be sacrificed. All was ready for the awful rite, which was to be carried out just before the Greeks' departure, but in the night he had managed to escape and hidden in a swamp, and from there he had watched the ships sail away. It was a good tale, and the Trojans never questioned it. They pitied Sinon and assured him that he should henceforth live as one of themselves. So it befell that by false cunning and pretended tears the Trojans were conquered, whom great Diomedes let me read this again. It was with false cunning and pretended tears that they were finally conquered. The Trojans, whom the great Diomedes had never overcome. nor savage Achilles, nor 10 years of warfare, nor 1,000 ships. Nothing had conquered them except false cunning and pretended tears. For Simon did not forget the second part of the story. The wooden horse had been made, he said, as an offering to Athena, and the reason for its immense size was to discourage the Trojans from taking it into the city. What the Greeks hoped for was that the Trojans would destroy it, and so draw upon them Athena's anger, that they would destroy it, and so Athena now would be angry with them, with the Trojans. Placed in the city, it would turn her favor to them and away from the Greeks. The story was clever enough to have had by itself, in all probability, the desired effect. But Poseidon, the most bitter of all the gods against Troy, contrived an addition which made the issue certain. What was that? Well, there was one priest with the Trojans, the priest Laocoon. When the horse was first discovered, he had been urgent with the Trojans to destroy it, destroy it, destroy it. And then he said those famous words, "I fear the Greeks, even when they come bearing gifts." Destroy the horse, he said. And also Cassandra, another of Priam's daughter, had echoed his warning, but of course no one ever listened to her, and she had gone back to the palace before Sinon appeared. So what happened was, with the help of Poseidon, the lord of the seas, that Laocoon, the prophet Laocoon, and his 2 sons heard his story with suspicion, Sion's story. But they were the only doubters there. As Sinon finished, suddenly over the sea came 2 fearful serpents swimming to the land. And once there, they glided straight to Laocoon, to the prophet Laocoon. They wrapped their huge coils around him and the 2 lads that were with him, and they crushed the life out of them. And then they disappeared within Athena's temple. And so now there could be no further hesitation. To the horrified spectators, Laocoon had been punished for opposing the entry of the horse, which most certainly no one else would now do. And all the people cried, "Bring the carven image in, bear it to Athena, fit gift for the child of Zeus." And so they dragged the horse through the gate and up to the temple of Athena. And then, rejoicing in their good fortune, believing the war ended and Athena's favor restored to them, they went to their houses in peace, as they had not done for 10 years. In the middle of the night, the door in the horse opened. One by one the chieftains let themselves down. They stole to the gates and threw them wide, and into the sleeping town marched the Greek army. What they had first to do could be carried out silently. Fires were started in buildings throughout the city. By the time the Trojans were awake, before they realized what had happened, while they were struggling into their armor, Troy was burning. They rushed out to the street one by one in confusion. Bands of soldiers were waiting there to strike each man down before he could join himself to others. It was not fighting, it was butchery. Very many died without ever a chance of dealing a blow in return. In the more distant parts of the town, the Trojans were able to gather together here and there, and then it was the Greeks who suffered. They were borne down by desperate men who wanted only to kill before they were killed. They knew that the one safety for the conquered was to hope for no safety. This spirit often turned the victors into the vanquished. The quickest-witted Trojans tore off their own armor and put on that of the dead Greeks, and many a Greek, thinking that he was joining friends, discovered too late that they were enemies and paid for their error with their life. But on top of the houses they tore up the roofs and hurled the beams down upon the Greeks. An entire tower standing on the roof of Priam's palace was lifted from its foundations and toppled over the Greeks. Exulting, the defenders saw it fall and annihilate a great band who were forcing the palace doors. But of course the success brought only a short respite. Others rushed up carrying a huge beam. Over the debris of the tower and the crushed bodies, they battered the doors with it. It crashed through, and the Greeks were in the palace before the Trojans could leave the roof. In the inner courtyard around the altar were the women and children, and one man, the old king. Achilles had spared Priam, but Achilles' son struck him down before the eyes of his wife and daughters. By now the end was near. The contest from the first had been unequaled. Too many Trojans had been slaughtered in the first surprise. The Greeks could not be beaten now. Slowly the defense ceased. Before morning all the leaders were dead except one, Aphrodite's son, Aeneas. He alone among the Trojan chiefs escaped. He fought the Greeks as long as he could. But there was no other Trojan to stand with him. And as the slaughter spread and death came near, he thought of his home, the helpless people he had left there. He could do nothing more for Troy, but perhaps something could be done for them. He hurried to them, his old father, his little son, his wife, and as he went, his mother Aphrodite appeared to him, urging him on and keeping him safe from the flames and from the Greeks. Even with the goddess's help, he could not save his wife. When they left the house, she got separated from him and was killed. But the other two he brought away, through the enemy, past the city gates, out into the country, his father on his shoulders, his son clinging to his hand. She helped Helen too. She got her out of the city and took her back to her husband, Menelaus. And he received her gladly, and as he sailed for Greece, she was with him. When morning came, what had been the proudest city in Asia was a fiery ruin. All that was left of Troy was a band of helpless captive women, whose husbands were dead, whose children had been taken from them. They were waiting for their masters to carry them overseas to slavery. Chief among the captives was the old queen Hecuba, and her daughter-in-law, Hector's wife, Andromache. For Hecuba all was ended. Crouched on the ground, she saw the Greek ships getting ready as she watched the city burn. Troy is no longer, she told herself, and I, who am I? A slave men drive like cattle. An old grey woman that has no home. What sorrow is there that is not mine? Country lost and husband and children, glory of all my house brought low. And the women around her answered, we stand at the same point of pain. We too are slaves, our children are crying, call to us with tears, Mother, I am all alone. To the dark ships now they drive me, and I cannot see you, Mother. One woman still had her child. Andromache, Hector's wife, held in her arms her son Astyanax, the little boy who had once shrunk back from his father's high-crested helmet. He is so young, she thought. They will let me take him with me. But from the Greek camp a herald came to her and spoke faltering words. He told her that she must not hate him for the news he was about to tell her, which he was doing against his will. Her son, and she then broke in, interrupted, you're not saying that he cannot go with me? He answered, the boy must die. The boy must be thrown down from the towering wall of Troy. Now, let it be done. Endure like a brave woman. Think, you are alone, one woman and a slave, and no help anywhere. She knew what he said was true. There was no help. She said goodbye to her child. Weeping, my little one, there, you cannot know what waits for you. How will it be, falling down, all broken, and none to pity? Kiss me, my dear, never again shall I see you. Come closer, closer. Your mother who bore you, put your arms around my neck. Now kiss me, lips to lips. The soldiers carry him away. Just before they threw him from the wall, they had killed on Achilles' grave a young girl too. They had killed Hecuba's daughter Polyxena in the same wall. With the death of Hector's son, Troy's last sacrifice was accomplished. The women waiting for the ships watched the end. Troy has perished, the great city. Only the red flame now lives there. The dust is rising, spreading out like a great wing of smoke, and all is hidden. We now are gone, one here, one there, and Troy is gone forever. Farewell, dear city, farewell, my country where my children lived. There below, the Greek ships wait for us. That's the story of Troy. Thank you for listening. Bye-bye.